On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, China and the U.S. to resume trade talks with some Chinese imports up for U.S. tariff exemption. And a young female Chinese writer ends up a science fiction trailblazer. Up close with sci-fi author Hao Jingfang.
We just try to express that actually technology is coming to our life.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We begin with the latest on China-U.S. trade row. The Chinese Commerce Ministry confirms trade talks with the U.S. will resume across the Pacific. The Trump administration said it would exempt 110 Chinese products from hefty tariffs after American companies complained the duties harmed their bottom lines. Take a look.
The world's two biggest economies will resume trade talks after a 2-month hiatus. On Tuesday, 110 Chinese products were out for tariff exemption, ranging from medical equipment to key capacitors, seen as an icebreaker since trade tensions started. The Chinese Commerce Ministry said the chief negotiators of both sides talked by phone on Tuesday.
Trade teams from the two sides will restart consultations on the basis of equality and mutual respect. China's stance on trade talks is consistent and clear.
U.S. pressure on Chinese telecom giant Huawei also eased a little. On Tuesday, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin has encouraged U.S. suppliers to seek governmental approval to resume selling equipment to Huawei. The telecom powerhouse has been caught in the middle of a prolonged trade spat after the U.S. added Huawei to a trade blacklist in May. A thaw in trade relations followed the meeting of the top leaders of both countries on the sidelines of the G20 summit last month. Mr. Trump agreed to hold off more tariffs on Chinese goods.
We agreed that I would not be putting tariffs on the $325 billion, and we sell to Huawei a tremendous amount of product that goes into the various things that they make, and I said that that's okay, that we will keep selling that product.
Trade issues do remain. Some of the sticking points include U.S. demands for China to buy more American farm products and Washington's controversial approval of a multi-billion-dollar arms sale to Taiwan. Larry Kudlow, the White House National Economic Council director, said the U.S. was looking for quality, not speed, in trade talks. China has kept an open door to negotiations, but ruled out giving in to all of Washington's demands.
China's core concerns must be well solved. We will definitely find solutions through equal dialogue and taking care of each other's reasonable concerns.
China has emphasized the best deal is one made out of mutual respect and goodwill.
For more on China-U.S. trade talks, we have in Washington Jeff Moon, an international trade and government affairs consultant who is also the former assistant U.S. trade rep for China. And also in Hong Kong, we have Edward Xie, chairman and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. Last but certainly not least, in our Beijing studio, Xu Sitao, the chief economist of Deloitte China. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. First of all, I hope you're going to have a great weekend, but the issue of trade is still with us. So go to you first, Mr. Moon. Tell us more about the U.S. reaction so far about the Huawei's call today to ask the U.S. to take it off from the so-called entity list of the Commerce Department. Mr. Moon.
Well, there have been statements already by the administration that that's not going to happen. Just a couple hours ago here in Washington, Peter Navarro, one of President Trump's senior advisors, said that Huawei will remain on the entities list. To the extent that there will be sales of technology to Huawei, that will come in the form of licensing exceptions. And that's what the report about Secretary Mnuchin encouraging companies. If that's true, that would be encouragement for companies to file for exceptions for certain technology purchases to be able to happen.
I see. Mr. Moon, according to your practical and certainly professional knowledge, how long it would take this process for companies to file, first of all, for application, then get permission, and eventually be able to resume interaction with Huawei. What does it mean for American companies who are now looking for solutions, Mr. Moon?
Well, I think that I'm not sure about the exact timelines.
Yes.
They can take a little bit of time, but the Huawei question is a very large question, and it involves three different dimensions. There's a national security dimension, of course, there's a trade dimension, and there's a law enforcement dimension that we haven't talked about yet. The national security dimension here is for the U.S. to precisely define what is the national security risk in terms of sales of technology to Huawei.
Yes.
The trade dimension involves applying narrowly tailored measures to address those security risks. And there's also a reciprocity issue here in terms of why Huawei should be able to do this kind of business, but American tech firms can't do this kind of business in China. And the last issue, law enforcement addresses prosecuting alleged violations, in this case bank fraud, perhaps by the chief financial officer.
All right.
So in order to resolve the Huawei issue writ large, we need to address all of these dimensions.
Obviously, from the U.S. perspective, it seems to be a very complicated process, and certainly there are different layers as they see as important. However, the Chinese side does not see it that way. Mr. Xu, you are not representing at all the Chinese government, but from your knowledge of what the Chinese businesses are thinking, because you've been interacting with them on a very frequent basis, and also the eventual issue about geopolitics, how is it reflected upon a crossfire on Huawei, what do you think is the concern or are the concerns from the Chinese side?
The concern is probably the argument of national security cannot be overused. For argument's sake, if this is indeed an issue of national security, then it can no longer be used as a bargaining chip for trade negotiations. So there is a contradiction. So that is why I think for both countries, when they are dealing with this, they cannot mix these two.
Meanwhile, if there were any violation, quote unquote, regarding national security or threat of national security, the U.S. side still need to specify it before it claimed that Huawei was a concern of the national security, isn't it, Mr. Xu, just to clarify?
Yeah, that's indeed the case.
Okay, so let me move on also to Mr. Xie about that. Huawei is only one of those cases between China and the United States. A company-specific one caught in the geopolitical crossfire. Do you see that as a symbol, whether U.S.-China trade issue will continue, or it should be dealt with very separately, Mr. Xie?
Unfortunately, the two sides of the issues are somewhat intermixed now. The trade issues are now intermixed with the relationship between businesses. From what I do, my work with many of my American clients, many of the American clients are actually very frustrated by the uncertainty and also the instability that they see, because they have invested a lot into China. They would like to do business with China, yet at the same time, the lack of resolution from the trade dispute standpoint have really caused them a lot of problems right now. And therefore, as you know, there has been quite a bit of reactions from the U.S. businesses on trying to sort of lobby or inform the Congress as well as the administration that you better come to some degree of resolution fast.
Interesting, Mr. Moon. Therefore, I go to you. We all understand that this is going to be a very political year for Washington with the election coming up. Meanwhile, the current White House is not necessarily in its best time, shall we say, with many things related to it still going on and boiling. So what would that mean at this timing for the U.S. to come to certain kinds of a cool consensus regarding its nature of relation with China and therefore, of course, its nature of relation in terms of trade and economic ties with China. Mr. Moon.
Well, your question touches upon a very important change in the negotiations that are going on right now. Up until May, when we had a break in the negotiations, really the talks were economically focused and in a problem-solving kind of way. We've now moved in, since negotiations have resumed, into a political season. In the United States, obviously, the presidential election now has started. And in China as well, in June there were some sensitive anniversaries, and there are other sensitive anniversaries coming up in October, and other high leadership meetings, so that politics is coming into play much more than before. And when politics is the dominating factor, nationalism plays very well, quite frankly. And that does not bode well for the trade negotiations, because it reduces flexibility when leaders are afraid to make the concessions necessary to get to a common understanding.
Mr. Xie, when it comes to the real discussion of the trade talks, obviously you heard already from China's Commerce Department talking about the resumption of talks, and also you heard from Mr. Liu He's phone call with the two secretaries from the United States Trade Rep and also Secretary of Finance earlier Tuesday. What do you consider as some of the pragmatic opening for the talks? And what are some of the topics, once the two sides touch upon, could be regarded as constructive basis to continue the conversation? Mr. Xie.
Yeah, I think so far what we have seen is that on the Chinese side have made proactive efforts to try to reinitiate the talks with the American team. I think the Chinese has made very clear that the discussion needs to be proceeded on the basis of mutual trust and open discussion, and that hopefully both sides will treat each other with mutual respect. And I think this will be a set of preconditions that the Chinese would like to see the Americans be forthcoming, also as a counteroffer to resume this talk.
On the other hand, though, Mr. Xu, there are always two sides, at least, of a coin. When the U.S. is going into its presidential election season, it is also the time when politicians are in a hurry to guarantee their voters that they have been doing something. Now, it is also a time that they want to say this is their legacy of one kind or another. So what does that mean? Is there a window opportunity for Washington and Beijing to be able to figure something out and therefore to present to both sides?
You're absolutely right. From U.S. side, election campaign already well underway. Even though economy right now is strong, but in 6 months, a year, we may see a pronounced slowdown of the U.S. economy. So that's giving incentive for President Trump to strike a deal with China on trade. In addition to that, when you look at tariff rate of 25%, so on and so forth, clearly it's just not realistic, because if you really impose 25% on certain companies, that really means those exporters, they need to give up the U.S. market, really permanently. And in reality, what we have seen in the past 6 months, that's indeed not the case, because people try to find ways to deal with the tariff. And in fact, in the past few days, and the news flow suggesting on the U.S. side, companies are allowed to apply this list, the exclusion list, not to be subject to the tariff. So all in all, I think both sides will have incentive to strike a deal within this year.
What about that window opportunity to you, Mr. Moon, particularly from the business perspective?
I think there is an incentive for both sides to come to an agreement. I really hope that they do. I question really whether there is the political will for that to happen. On the U.S. side, as we go into the election, if President Trump can reach an agreement that fully addresses American priorities, purchases, market openings, industrial policy, enforcement, that truly addresses those, then that would be an achievement that would be helpful with the voters. However, during the election, whatever deal he reaches will be scrutinized carefully and criticized heavily. And if the deal is not defensible, it's not worth reaching. And the Chinese posture right now suggests that we may not be able to get to that kind of an agreement, at least in the short term. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I'm really not that optimistic about it. On the economic side, I agree that there are clouds on the horizon, but the stock market yesterday reached all-time highs. Unemployment in the U.S. is at a low, a 50-year low. So there may be softening coming, but if Trump was ever going to have this kind of a trade war, I hate to say it, but this might be the time for him to do it.
Of course, it is the strategy for negotiation, Mr. Xie, that one side would bolster the stance, describing the picture as beautiful as possible, suggesting there's no hurry to reach a deal. It's always one of those negotiation skills. But Mr. Xie, how much do you see a window opportunity? Meanwhile, what Mr. Moon said is very interesting as to what he considered as the Chinese approach might be step by step, not in a hurry either, because China wants to reach a deal that what it considers as fair and sustainable. So, Mr. Xie, what do you think about the earlier questions and comments?
With respect to the Chinese government stance, my sense is that the Chinese government have laid out the principles for negotiations very clearly, which I just mentioned already a few minutes ago. I think the speed issue is in a way irrelevant, not that relevant as long as the principle is going to be adhered. So that's my answer to your question on the Chinese government stance. With respect to the U.S. side, my own read is that in addition to the election issue, the U.S. team actually, the U.S. administration actually also consists of different consistencies. There are people who are more on the hawkish side, and therefore they would like to be tougher on China, or for the matter, any other sort of quote-unquote enemies that they see. Yet at the same time, there are people who would like to come to resolution quickly. At least to my knowledge, there are plenty of businesses in the U.S. who would really want to continue to do business with China simply because China is such a huge market, in particular actually for the suppliers on the electronics to the manufacturer of consumer electronics in China. As you know, for a long time there's a symbiotic relationship. The U.S. have technology on certain critical components. They ship to China. China design and manufacture them and ship them back to the U.S. That has always been a very, in a way, beneficial, mutually beneficial relationship.
Right.
But with the artificial chop by the so-called trade measures, this has been chopped up. And many of the American suppliers are actually feeling a lot of pain in this process.
Yes.
So I think to your question about the timing from the U.S. side, I believe that there's also a lot of pressure from certain factions within the U.S. community that is now trying to force this issue to go through in a reasonable speed.
I see. Mr. Xu, when we are asking the question about whether Washington is having a consensus as to what is the nature of relations in the future between China and the United States, one could also ask that question toward China about what does it mean, this apparent trade war, for Chinese thinking and consensus about relations with the United States. Now, when you have, whether it's sanctions or tariffs and Huawei caught in geopolitical crossfire, and you have companies that are having a difficult time, international ones, providing Chinese companies, tech companies, with components. What does it mean for the argument in China to establish as much as possible its own chain of supplies, every part of it?
Sure. I mean, clearly, there's a school of thought, and in China, you need to be self-reliant, not just in technology, and even, for example, energy.
Is this strengthened by the current situation between China and the United States?
Complicated. That's one school of thought.
I see.
The other school of thought is the trade war. It's a bit like a stress test for financial institutions. So that's the necessary external pressure for China actually to even open up the market. And once China's vast domestic market open up, then of course business community at large and will lobby on China's behalf. I still think second school of thought is dominant at this point.
Just to follow up about that, it makes sense, right, what you have just said. However, with uncertainties, as a result of this ongoing trade war, because you never know when it would end, and with what result, at what speed, and how the implementation can be done. And therefore, what does it mean, really, for businesses and for this thinking?
I think for business, I think people are realistic. In the end, I don't think we go back to April-May period. Even the deal we are discussing, it's not a grand bargain. Maybe it's a temporary agreement. So at least we don't see additional hike on tariffs, and at least we see some ease of restrictions for Chinese companies to invest in the U.S. Not just that, and also cultural exchange, so on and so forth. And of course, some of the sticky point being alluded by U.S. colleague, I think they will be addressed, but in the medium term.
Mr. Moon, so here's the thing. It seems that a lot has been said by the three of you gentlemen, but there has to be something for the near term to give people hope, at least for businesses from both sides and the global economy. And then also some of the other complicated issues be handled step by step. Do you think that would be a logic accepted by both sides for the near future, Mr. Moon?
Well, I think we've learned some important things from the trade war so far. One is that neither side is self-reliant, that we are dependent upon each other. China on technology, say with regard to chips, the U.S. with regard to rare earth metals. There are lots of other examples as well. That means that there can be no decoupling, as some people in Washington like to talk about. Decoupling is impossible. We need to find a way to work things out. And in order to work things out, we need to reach some kind of an agreement with regard to these trade issues. I don't know that it's going to happen in the short term. Mr. Xu talked about a sort of a small agreement on certain issues without getting to the comprehensive issues. I'm not sure in this political season that Trump could reach a small agreement and go to voters and say that's all he got for all of the stress that we've had over the past year.
But it also has a lot to do with how is he going to portray it, right? No matter what you reach, it's going to be important as to how you describe it for whoever side and by whoever. So that's always one of the things that we have to bear in mind as well. And one big deal in one side might be a small deal in the other side. Well, a not make much difference deal in one side could be a huge difference deal in the other side. So it really depends also on the sectors that we're talking about as well. And Mr. Xie, what do you think, a short term, middle term? Is that the logic as you see it?
Yeah, I think to come up with a comprehensive deal that all sides and all factions, by the way, within the U.S., or for the matter in China, are all happy about, the whole deal in the near term is probably going to be quite difficult, simply because of the different interests within the different sides. However, I think that coming up with some pragmatic measures in the short term, even the measures that we were talking about, some exceptional lists for certain exceptions, for certain things or certain companies that they can do certain things in the meantime, is going to create some degree of certainty or certain degree of businesses. I think this is probably going to happen in the short term.
We have very limited time. Of course, it's only 110 companies that get so-called exemption, and it takes a long process of application. This is only a drop in the sea. Mr. Xu, final words from you. Short-term, mid-term?
Short-term, at least I would call that ceasefire, or how you define that. And some Americans saying this is like a baseball game, maybe in the second inning, third inning. In the medium term, and some of these issues will be addressed. And also to China's best interest, for example, reforming state-owned sector.
I see. Xu Sitao, Edward Xie, Jeff Moon, thank you so much. If it's a baseball rule, I probably have to go back and check it, how it works. Thank you so much for the three of you. Have a great weekend.